There's an opinion piece in the Burger newspaper last week by political writer Dennis Cruywagen. Dennis is also a former ANC Parliamentary spokesperson, making his opinion known that 30 years after democracy, that an ANC-led government is still espousing Verwoedian views on race and race classification, that we're still, one would argue, for statistical purposes, still segmented into black, white, colored, Indian in South Africa, and that somehow bleeds into how we interact with each other. It's received a fair bit of response, and I think it's worth talking about. We also will be speaking to a member of the ANC's Western Cape Provincial Executive Committee, Dr. Wesley Seale, getting his response on that. But Dennis Cruywagen joins me on the line. A very emotive title to your opinion piece, Dennis, saying that the ANC is closer to Verwoed than it is to Mandela, making the argument that with ongoing race classification in South Africa, 30 years into a democratic and constitutional South Africa, that is still espousing that particular divide. What brings you to this particular conclusion, especially that you've been closely involved working in and around the ANC in the province and nationally as well?
Good morning, Lester. Thank you. Good morning, Dr. Seale. Lester, as a journalist, you should know that I was not responsible for the headline, but the headline really encapsulates my views. And that is, there's hardly anywhere in our country today that you can escape racial classification, whichever form you are given to fill out. In there is a category which says race, and you've got to classify yourself. Now, the F.W. de Klerk, who was the last white president of South Africa, or then it was a different South Africa, it wasn't the democratic South Africa, he then outlawed or removed from the statute books racial classification. In the new country, we are asked to classify ourselves. To what end? Yeah, we can argue statistical purposes, but that's not good enough because it sinks into society and it stays there and it enforces group identity.
There would be the argument that the self-identifying of race on a particular institutional form or tick box does not describe the fundamental rights that you are afforded, but is there in the proper administration of statistics, the implementation of the plan of redress, noting that people who were denoted as black or African in an apartheid regime received far less rights than others, and in order to have a proper policy of redress, we still, for the time being, have to note who is or has been historically disadvantaged, and black, colored, Indian, and a white South African does then give an accurate measure of who has been historically disadvantaged. Dennis?
Lester, yeah, that's an interesting observation. The fact is that those people who were disadvantaged in the previous regime did not identify themselves. They were forced to get those categories, and the previous regime divided the country into different segments, if one could use that word. So to continue with that and then to say, okay, under apartheid, Africans suffered more than coloreds, who in turn suffered more than Indians. And here I thought the Freedom Charter says that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. Our preamble to the Constitution makes that same point. I think, yes, we have to redress the wrongs of the past, but when does it stop? Take the Western Cape, where in the prison services, prison warders had to take the Department of Correctional Services to court because they were discriminated because the department was employing more Africans than coloreds. That creates resentment between different groups, and it's not good. Yeah, in the Western Cape, we have colored parties or people who represent colored interest only, and that is bad. That really is bad. We also now have the Cape Forum who wants to secede from the country because they believe coloreds are being discriminated against and others. That's not good. It does not bode well for the future.
Dr. Wesley Seale, Provincial Executive Member for the ANC in the province, does ongoing classification give people the opportunity to go into certain cultural and race-based lagers? And that's what we've seen in the last local government elections, where people have been attracted to very, very narrow racial or cultural-based political movements. Wesley, good morning.
Good morning to you, Lester, and good morning to Mr. Cruywagen as well. I certainly hope this is not the last time that you're going to invite me, Lester. But let me start off with what an absolute cacophony of confusion in this article. I'm glad that Mr. Cruywagen at the very beginning endorsed the headline. It says that the ANC today is closer to Verwoed than Nelson Mandela. Well, let me remind Mr. Cruywagen that no less than 27 pieces of legislation entailing race was passed under Madiba. Madiba signed 27 pieces of legislation into law. 27. How many under Jacob Zuma? 0. How many under Cyril Ramaphosa? 0. So it's a cacophony of absolute confusion that is overtaking race denialists like Mr. Cruywagen. I'm sorry to say that. What he wants to do is he wants us to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You don't say because government officials are not implementing employment equity in correctional services, that's why you must throw the baby out with the bathwater. We've learned from that. We've made sure that regulations put in place must ensure regional statistics when they are taken into account. So absolutely, what he is looking at is trying to say that the ANC is closer to Verwoed. No, the ANC, Mr. Cruywagen, should really want. What Mr. Cruywagen wants are his heroes like F.W. de Klerk. That's what he says. Because F.W. de Klerk did away with racial laws and certainly not Madiba.
If the construct of race is a social construct, and it has been constructed against people who didn't classify them in any particular way, why then is it still implemented, particularly in an ANC itself that has to co-opt members of different demographic and groups in South Africa, because we did not see an adequate representation of the broader South African demographic in an ANC National Executive Committee, essentially looking for people to be representative of different cultural and backgrounds into the ANC's National Executive.
Yeah, you mentioned a number of issues there, but let me respond to another confusion which your question touches on, which Mr. Cruywagen also has in his. The ANC is not doing pencil tests. The ANC is classifying nobody. People must fill in on the forms for themselves. So, for example, Mr. Cruywagen's mother, who is very proud of her native roots, which he mentions in the article. Native roots, I'm assuming that she is talking about people like the Khoi, the San, the Griqua, the Kuku, etc., etc. Those people, Africans, they classify themselves. The state doesn't classify them like we did pre-1994. And so again, this is another example of trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think, Lester, the question you should really ask Mr. Cruywagen is he a race denialist? Is he denying that more than 350 years of racism in this country must be wiped out in 30 years? That's the question we must ask Mr. Cruywagen and those who think like him.
Dennis, I'd like you to respond to that.
Lester, I do think that when it comes to race denialism, that's a very interesting question. And I appreciate Dr. Seale asking that question. Why should I deny race? I am black, I'm African, I'm Khoi. I come from Genadendal, where my roots are. My forefathers, as I've written quite often, have experienced attempts to exterminate them, severe discrimination. So why should I be a race denialist? The ANC under current policies do not recognize my Africanness. According to the ANC, I am colored. We cannot get away from that. That is what the ANC is. ANC says, I am colored. And if I fill out a form and I write African, that designation is deleted and it's replaced by colored. That's a fact. Ask the people who are called colored. Ask them. That's the reality. Why would there be a party formed by Fadil Adams to advance colored interests or to defend colored interests? Because people feel aggrieved. And that is dangerous. That is not non-racialism.
Wesley, I like your diagnosis of this movement of voters into very narrow, often race-based political spheres. We have seen in the last local government elections that people have largely left a middle political home and gone to the fringes, often in lagers either on race or language. I'd like your diagnosis of this political phenomenon of people not necessarily finding themselves in a political or identifiable center, but moving to the fringes, particularly for political parties that represent people who may look and sound like them.
Well, Lester, thank you for the question. It's a very interesting one. It's a direct result of the failure of neoliberalism. We had the crash in 2008, 2009, and what we saw then was this upsurge in negative nationalism. So we saw it through Brexit, we saw it through Trump being elected, we saw it through Narendra Modi being elected. And so there is this global movement. South Africa is not unique in the sense of this move towards the right. It's a direct result of the failure of capitalism. It's a direct result of the failure of neoliberalism, because those who were told to the survival of the fittest. Well, the fittest have survived. That's why we have Trump, Narendra Modi, and Brexit. And the people who are moving towards the fringes or the margins, as you indicate, are towards this nationalism precisely because they feel they're down by the system, precisely because they feel down by the system. Again, so it's important for us to realize that, yes, absolutely, race does play. And I'm glad that Mr. Cruywagen has now pointed out the importance that race plays, because what the ANC is trying to envisage, and what the ANC is certainly been trying to do, including Nelson Mandela, who enacted those 27 laws, is to make sure that we correct the injustices of the past. Now, Mr. Cruywagen wants us to throw that out of the window. He wants us to delete all race laws. And what he's actually encouraging again is the survival of the fittest. And so that if we don't have employment equity, if we don't have BEE, those who are strong now, who are fit now, are going to survive. They're going to make it in life. And Tandi, who is found, or even Ashika, who is found in Bonteheuwel, who is found in Khayelitsha, is not going to make it in life, simply because the state, through its laws, are not supporting them and making sure that they get a better shot at life. That's what we are trying to do. It's the responsibility of the state to look after the weakest in society, not the strongest. And if you do away with race laws that we currently have on our statute books at the moment, you're going to be doing exactly that. Supporting the rich, the wealthy, the well-off, the grey colleges, the Westerfords of this life, instead of making sure that we are looking after the child in the township.
Seven, we're speaking to Dennis Cruywagen, political writer, as well as Wesley Seale, is a member of the provincial executive of the ANC in the Western Cape. We were talking about Dennis's opinion piece in the Burger newspaper, which headline says, because of race classification still on statute books 30 years after democracy, the ANC is closer to Verwoed than Mandela. To Wesley's point on how we identify, Dennis, if people like you and like me identify as a black South African, I do too, like you say you identify as a black South African, I can also identify at the very, very same time as being a coloured South African with all its cultural dimensions. I can also acknowledge my indigene roots as a South African. If that is then the case, if a tick box test gives you options, why not simply just tick the black South African if that is how the system judges you in order to rectify some sort of to see to some form of redress. Identify on a form as black South Africans, tick the box, and you create a movement for all people of colour simply to identify on a checklist to say, I'm a black South African, Dennis.
Lester, unfortunately, there's no such tick box. That tick box says coloured or Indian or white or African. There is no such tick box for a black South African. But back to some of the
you
points
can make the
that,
choice, and you can make the choice and deliberately say, I'm not a coloured South African, I'm not a Indian South African, I'm not a white South African. I'm an African, and you would have that choice to tick it on that particular government form, whatever institutional form.
Of course, if you could do that. But as with apartheid, you have people sitting there and doing a racial classification and will delete African, where you classify yourself as African, will take a look at you and write coloured. I think the real test will be in next year's election. See what the majority of people who are at the receiving end of what I call race-based policies, see how they will vote. There'll be more blood on the floor. See how they vote.
Wesley, I'll have you have the last word. We have about 60 seconds. Let's wrap up this conversation.
No, I think that Dennis is absolutely correct. The people who are going to be at the receiving end, by and large, the African National Congress's base, are going to be indicating what their preferences are. And I think that parties, it's not only parties, this is, as I pointed out earlier, this is a global phenomenon. So again, it's another confusion that Mr. Cruywagen has, that these elections are going to be marred by nationalism, by black consciousness, and hence we are seeing even parties such as the EFF growing. Even the Minority Front, for example, is growing. So I think that it's really isn't something that is to do with based on the race laws. I think that in Afrikaans they say, Mr. Cruywagen het die pot misgesit. And I think that first is talk about Madiba and the ANC being closer to Verwoed than Madiba is completely not based on fact. As I said, Madiba enacted 27 pieces of legislation, Jacob Zuma 0, Cyril Ramaphosa 0, and yet Mr. Cruywagen wants to tell the ANC today that it is closer. But my final question to Mr. Cruywagen certainly is, 18 months ago, he was still working for the ANC. What has changed in the last 18 months? Nothing has changed besides Mr. Cruywagen's lot. And that's why he can write articles like he does today. Because nothing has changed as far as race laws are concerned in the last 18 months. And yes, Mr. Cruywagen was still in the employ of the ANC 18 months ago. The ANC was good enough for Mr. Cruywagen 18 months ago. What has changed in the last 18 months? Nothing.
Dennis Cruywagen, Wesley Seale, really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for the cordial conversation between the three of us. Hope to do it again, and we'll possibly talk the closer we get to elections somewhere between May and August in 2024. Have a very good day. Thanks so much for joining us.